Beneath the crowded streets of modern Rome, far below the echo of tourist footsteps and cathedral bells, lies a door most people will never see. It sits at the end of a muted corridor, wrapped in shadows that seem older than the stones themselves, guarded by iron bands that haven't moved for centuries. Beyond it, the Vatican secret archives stretch into a darkness lined with manuscripts no living soul is allowed to touch. Scholars whisper that these halls contain stories too fragile, too dangerous, or too inconvenient for the world outside. And as you stand before that silent threshold, one question begins to rise like cold air from the floor. What if the Gospels we know are only fragments of a much larger truth? The first whispers began during the Renaissance, when curious scholars found hints in old letters and marginal notes that did not match the official story. Monks copying manuscripts spoke cautiously of writing they were told never to open, texts described only as too dangerous to read, as if knowledge itself could bruise the soul. Travelers returned from Rome claiming they had glimpsed catalog entries for gospels no church recognized, their titles fading like ghosts in the dust. These rumors stirred an unsettling possibility that early church leaders had once sifted through a much larger library of Christian writings, choosing which voices would survive and which would disappear behind locked doors. And if that was true, what vanished teachings still lingered somewhere in the Vatican's silent depths? Across the early centuries, a strange pattern emerges. Texts once referenced openly by bishops and monks begin to vanish from history as if swallowed by the earth. Letters from the 2nd and 3rd centuries mention gospels now lost, citing passages that no surviving manuscript contains. Then, abruptly, the references stop. Titles once copied with confidence fade from catalogs, and entire works slip out of circulation without explanation. Scholars trace these disappearances like fading footprints, noting how some texts linger for decades before abruptly falling silent. Why would widely known writings evaporate so completely? Were they destroyed, hidden, or quietly removed from the record? Each disappearance deepens the suspicion that someone, somewhere, was curating which stories the world was allowed to remember. And so we arrive at the question that has haunted historians for centuries. Did the Vatican intentionally conceal alternate versions of Jesus' teachings? Or were these texts simply swept away by the chaos of time? Official explanations point to loss, decay, and the natural erosion of ancient manuscripts. Yet the gaps feel too precise, too aligned with moments when the early church sought unity amid theological conflict. If the missing Gospels truly posed no threat, why do their traces vanish just as doctrine hardened? Were church leaders protectors of fragile truth, or editors shaping a narrative meant to endure? Caught between respectable scholarship and lingering suspicion, we are left standing at the threshold of a mystery that refuses to fade, demanding to know what was hidden and why. In the earliest centuries of Christianity, the landscape of belief was far more crowded and diverse than the tidy canon we know today. Communities scattered across the Mediterranean produced their own gospels, some poetic, some cryptic, others boldly at odds with one another. These writings offered alternate memories of Jesus, different teachings and conflicting visions of what his message truly meant. Yet only 4 were ultimately chosen to represent the faith, while dozens slipped into obscurity. Historians still debate how these decisions were made and why certain voices were elevated while others vanished. At councils where doctrine hardened, The future of global belief was quietly shaped, leaving us to wonder what riches were lost in the narrowing of the Christian story. Among the most intriguing of the vanished writings are those we know only through fleeting references in ancient commentaries. The Gospel of the Hebrews, the Gospel of the Nazarenes, and the Gospel of the Egyptians once circulated widely enough for church fathers to quote them, sometimes respectfully, sometimes with unease. Yet the manuscripts themselves disappeared, leaving behind only fragments preserved in arguments about doctrine. These fragments hint at stories that challenge the familiar narrative, portraying Jesus with nuances that never made it into the canon. What truths or contradictions might have lived in the missing pages? And why do we possess only echoes rather than the full texts? Each lost gospel invites a haunting possibility that history preserved the versions most convenient, while others were quietly allowed to fade forever. Early Christianity was never a single, unified movement, but a mosaic of competing interpretations. In some communities, Jesus was remembered as a mystical teacher, in others as a divine figure whose nature transcended human understanding. Even the role of Mary Magdalene shifted dramatically from one tradition to another, sometimes portrayed as a favored disciple, sometimes erased from importance entirely. These conflicting versions of the same story suggest a vibrant, contested past in which different groups preserved their own truths. If certain gospels had survived, they might have reshaped core doctrines we now take for granted. Their absence leaves us wondering how many possibilities were trimmed away before the Christian narrative reached its familiar form. What else might have been forgotten? For the early church, unity was not simply an aspiration, but a necessity for survival. Dozens of interpretations of Jesus' teachings circulated, each carrying the potential to fracture an already fragile community. Leaders feared that unchecked diversity would invite confusion, conflict, or even collapse. So the label of heresy became a powerful tool. Once a text was branded dangerous, it could be removed from discussion without explanation, its ideas buried beneath official doctrine. But what counted as dangerous and who made that decision? A mystical teaching, a different portrayal of Jesus, a challenge to authority. Any could threaten the emerging order. In this climate of vigilant control, many writings disappeared, leaving us to question whether their loss protected the faith or concealed inconvenient truths that still echo through history today, unchallenged. The Gospel of Mary first surfaced not in a grand archive, but in a dusty Cairo market in 1896, tucked among forgotten manuscripts sold to travelers who barely understood what they were holding. When scholars finally examined the brittle pages, they discovered a text so radical and so incomplete that its very survival felt like an accident of history. Half the manuscript was missing, torn away long before it reached modern hands, leaving its story fractured and hauntingly open-ended. Yet even in its broken form, the gospel hinted at ideas powerful enough to unsettle the foundations of early Christian belief. And this raised an irresistible question: what astonishing teachings might have lived in those vanished pages, now lost forever to sand, time, and silence? Within the surviving passages, Mary Magdalene emerges not as a marginal follower, but as Jesus' most trusted confidant, a disciple who understood his teachings more deeply than the others. She speaks with clarity and authority, offering explanations that leave the male apostles stunned and uneasy. Their doubt threaded through the narrative, reveals a tension that feels surprisingly modern: who is allowed to interpret the sacred and who is dismissed before they even begin. If this gospel reflects early Christian memory, it suggests a world in which women held spiritual leadership, guiding communities with wisdom rather than being confined to the edges of the story. The implications are staggering. What if the earliest followers of Jesus saw Mary not as a witness, but as a teacher standing at the center of the movement? The Gospel of Mary's remaining pages offer a vision of spirituality rooted not in ritual or institution, but in inner revelation. Jesus speaks of freedom from oppressive powers, urging followers to seek truth within themselves rather than through external authority. Salvation in this telling is not earned by obedience to hierarchy, but discovered through personal awakening. Such ideas, gentle yet revolutionary, clashed with the emerging structure of the church, which relied on order, leadership, and clearly defined doctrine. If believers were encouraged to find divine truth independently, what role would clergy play? It is no wonder scholars suspect that these teachings, so unlike the canonical Gospels, might have been viewed as destabilizing and quietly set aside. Scholars often point to a tangle of reasons why the Gospel of Mary never entered the canon. Its unconventional theology, its bold elevation of a female disciple, and its emphasis on inner authority over institutional control. In a world where church leaders were shaping doctrine and consolidating power, a text that challenged both gender norms and hierarchical structures would have been profoundly unwelcome. Political concerns intertwined with theological caution, creating an environment in which Mary's gospel had little chance of survival. Yet a lingering mystery remains. If this incomplete manuscript surfaced in Cairo, could the Vatican or other ancient repositories hold more complete versions, tucked away in sealed collections? And if such pages do exist, what truths might they contain that the world has not yet been permitted to see? In 1945, near the Egyptian town of Nag Hammadi, a group of farmers unearthed a sealed clay jar buried deep in the desert for more than 16 centuries. Inside lay a collection of ancient manuscripts, their pages fragile but astonishingly intact. Among them was a text few had ever imagined would surface, the Gospel of Thomas. When scholars examined it, shock rippled through theological circles. What unsettled them was not the possibility of forgery, but the unnerving likelihood that this gospel might predate the canonical four. Its simple, unadorned sayings of Jesus felt raw, unfiltered, almost primitive. If Thomas truly reflected an older tradition, then the story of Christian origins was far more complex than anyone had dared to admit. Within the Gospel of Thomas, Jesus appears not as a miracle-working figure of divine drama, but as a guide offering hidden wisdom to those willing to look beyond the surface of things. His words pulse with mystical depth, urging seekers to discover what lies within, warning that those who fail to understand themselves cannot understand him. This portrait stands in sharp contrast to the institutional model of faith that later emerged. It hints at early communities who believed enlightenment came not from ritual, hierarchy, or even scripture, but from direct personal insight. If Thomas circulated widely in the first centuries, why did it vanish so completely afterward? What about this quiet, introspective gospel made it unwelcome, even threatening in the evolving landscape of Christian authority? Some of Thomas's sayings strike at the heart of institutional religion. They suggest that divine reality resides inside each person, accessible without priests, temples, or sacraments. One verse claims the kingdom is spread out upon the earth, unseen only because people fail to perceive it. Another challenges followers to strip away illusions until nothing remains but the truth they already carry. These ideas decentralize power, shifting spiritual authority from clergy to individual experience. Such teachings pose an eerie question. If early Christians once embraced this radical inner path, did the church later bury these words to preserve structure and control? Silence surrounding Thomas for centuries makes the absence feel deliberate, as if someone feared what these verses might inspire. For decades, rumors have circulated among scholars and archivists that fragments of the Gospel of Thomas existed long before the Nag Hammadi discovery. Medieval catalogs reference unnamed sayings collections, and several Renaissance collectors hinted at possessing mysterious logia attributed to early Christian sects. Some even claimed the Vatican housed obscure gospel fragments that were never made public, studied only by select theologians. If true, it raises a provocative possibility that church authorities knew of Thomas, perhaps even recognized its antiquity, but chose to let it remain hidden. Was this caution scholarly restraint, or a quiet decision to avoid disrupting a carefully shaped narrative? Until the archives fully open, the question lingers, casting a long shadow over the story of this extraordinary text. When the Gospel of Judas emerged from a crumbling papyrus in the 1970s, it stunned scholars with a narrative so unthinkable that it seemed designed to overturn centuries of certainty. Here, Judas Iscariot, the name synonymous with betrayal, was not the traitor of Christian memory, but the one disciple who truly grasped Jesus' purpose. Instead of condemning him, the text portrays Jesus guiding Judas toward an act of obedience disguised as treachery, a secret mission hidden from the others. This reversal didn't merely challenge tradition, it dismantled the emotional core of one of history's most familiar stories. If Judas was not a villain, but the chosen confidant, what else in the early Christian world had been misunderstood, reshaped, or quietly rewritten? The Gospel of Judas is far stranger than a simple reinterpretation of a disciple's role. It contains layers of cosmology unfamiliar to mainstream Christianity, describing realms of spiritual beings, flawed creators, and a universe governed by hidden forces. At moments, Jesus seems almost amused by the disciples' attempts to understand him, laughing at their literal interpretations and their dependence on material rituals. He speaks instead of a spiritual identity untouched by earthly structures, a self that must awaken beyond the visible world. Such ideas were explosive in a church striving for doctrinal clarity. A gospel claiming that divine truth bypassed religious authority and residing instead in esoteric insight was not just unconventional, it was dangerous. No wonder early leaders condemned it. But condemnation raises its own question. What specifically were they afraid people might realize? The manuscript that carried these unsettling ideas had a journey as turbulent as its contents. Smuggled out of Egypt, hidden in safes, passed between collectors who neither understood nor preserved it, the text spent years deteriorating in humidity and neglect. At one point, scholars feared it would disintegrate entirely before anyone could read it. Its survival feels accidental, as if we caught only a late glimpse of a tradition almost erased by time and mishandling. And this naturally sparks an unsettling thought. If one gospel nearly disappeared through such a chaotic chain of custody, how many others slipped away without leaving a trace? How many stories, teachings, or alternate memories of Jesus vanished before the modern world even knew to look for them? After the Gospel of Judas became public, whispers circulated that internal Vatican scholars had examined similar texts long before the official announcement, but their findings were never released. The Church denied possessing earlier copies, yet some researchers noted the curiously cautious tone of their statements, as though trying to acknowledge the text without revealing too much. Historically, Your Lady, the Vatican has maintained procedures for sensitive manuscripts, cataloging them in restricted sections accessible only to vetted experts. If a disturbing gospel appeared in that system, it could be studied, classified, and quietly archived without ever reaching the outside world. Whether this happened with Judas remains unproven, but the possibility lingers. And in that lingering uncertainty lies the larger question: how many revelations remain sealed, waiting behind doors the world may never be allowed to open? The Vatican Apostolic Archives, despite centuries of legend, are not entirely hidden. The Church openly acknowledges their existence, describing them as a vast repository of letters, decrees, and documents stretching back more than a millennium. Scholars granted permission can wander certain reading rooms, studying carefully curated boxes of material selected by archivists. Yet this accessibility is tightly controlled. Only a fraction of the catalog is available, and requests for specific manuscripts must be approved with meticulous scrutiny. Entire categories are absent from public lists, sealed behind layers of administrative procedure. What the Vatican admits is substantial, but what it withholds is greater still, creating a maze of knowledge where light falls only on the corridors the Church chooses to illuminate. Beyond the publicly accessible shelves lie areas scholars rarely, if ever, see. Sections containing Inquisition records, papal investigations into heresy, and documents from the earliest centuries of Christianity. Many of these files remain sealed under rules that have survived countless reforms and papal transitions. Some date back over 1,500 years, long past any political danger they once posed, raising an uneasy question: why keep ancient material hidden now? The official explanation cites preservation, sensitivity, or incomplete classification, yet the secrecy feels excessive for texts older than most nations. Among historians, suspicion grows that these locked sections may contain writings that challenge the established narrative of Christian origins. Whether true or not, the very act of withholding them deepens the sense that something within those vaults is not meant for public eyes. Over the years, a handful of scholars permitted into the archives have shared curious, often unsettling accounts. Some describe glimpsing catalog numbers that appear nowhere in public indexes, referencing unnamed manuscripts categorized only as apocrypha or fragments. Others recall notes hinting at gospel-like texts. Though no titles were listed, these testimonies, impossible to verify and easy to dismiss, nevertheless recur with uncanny consistency. No one claims to have read these mysterious items. They merely saw traces, footprints in the sand, suggesting something once walked there. It is precisely this combination of ambiguity and possibility that keeps the rumors alive. Until transparency replaces secrecy, no one can say whether these scholars encountered clerical oversights or the faint shadows of suppressed history. Perhaps the most intriguing mystery involves the catalogs themselves. In several archival inventories, scholars have found physical gaps, pages removed, sections abruptly renumbered, references cut short without explanation. Archivists attribute these anomalies to routine reorganization or clerical error, yet the pattern raises eyebrows. Why do the missing portions often correspond to early Christian materials or unidentified manuscripts? Were pages misplaced, damaged, or purposefully extracted? With centuries of administrative shifts, any explanation is plausible, but the absence invites speculation more potent than the documents themselves. If records of certain texts disappeared from the catalogs, what might that suggest about the fate of the manuscripts they once described? In these silent omissions, the idea of lost gospels gains its most haunting fuel, not from what is present, but from what has been made to vanish. In the early centuries, Christianity was less a unified religion and more a constellation of small, vibrant communities, each holding its own interpretation of Jesus' message. Alternate gospels thrived in this environment, offering visions of faith that sometimes contradicted one another so sharply that they could not coexist peacefully. As the church grew, leaders understood that controlling doctrine meant ensuring survival. A fragmented faith could not withstand external pressures or internal fractures. Gospels that promoted ideas outside the emerging orthodoxy endangered this consolidation of authority. If every community followed its own version of truth, no structure could bind them together. Thus, competing theologies were not merely philosophical disagreements. They were threats to the very power the church was struggling to establish. Some of the most controversial gospels elevated voices that later tradition tried to marginalize. Texts portraying women as teachers or spiritual leaders challenged a hierarchy increasingly dominated by men. Others offered mystical insights suggesting that divine knowledge came from inner awakening rather than obedience to institutional authority. For a church attempting to define clear boundaries, such freedom was dangerous. If individuals believed they could encounter the sacred without priests, rituals, or sanctioned teachings, the entire structure of control was weakened. These writings encouraged believers to seek answers within themselves, to question authority, and to explore interpretations not mediated by clerical power. It is no surprise that such texts became prime candidates for suppression. They threatened not only doctrine, but the very social order the church sought to maintain. As theological debates intensified, the church developed a devastatingly effective tool for silencing dissent: the label of heresy. Once a text or teacher was branded heretical, no further justification was needed. Manuscripts could be removed, communities disbanded, ideas erased without public scrutiny. Many writings disappeared under this single word, leaving behind only hints in the criticisms of those who condemned them. What ideas were so intolerable that they warranted elimination rather than discussion? The historical record rarely tells us. Instead, the label itself became a veil, obscuring the content it targeted. In its shadow, countless teachings may have vanished, not because they were false, but because they clashed with the version of Christianity the church chose to preserve. When viewed across time, the decisions of early councils appear not as isolated acts, but as steps in a long pattern of narrowing the Christian narrative. From the debates of the 2nd century to the political maneuvering of the 4th, texts were accepted or rejected with remarkable consistency. Those reinforcing unity survived, while those complicating the story faded into obscurity. Later centuries continued this approach through censorship, selective preservation, and quiet omission. The goal was not merely theological clarity, but control over how the faith's origins were remembered. By shaping the past, the church shaped its authority in the present, and so the question lingers: how many voices were buried to protect a single story? The echoes of those silenced gospels still reverberate, hinting at a richer, more contested history beneath the one we inherited. In recent decades, the call for greater transparency has grown louder as historians push for broader access to the Vatican's vast archives. They argue that understanding early Christianity requires confronting every surviving document, not just the ones deemed appropriate for research. Yet the Vatican's response has been cautious, opening select materials while keeping others firmly restricted. This guarded approach, though often defended as preservation or protocol, deepens public suspicion. Why, scholars ask, should ancient texts remain sealed when their historical value is undeniable? The more carefully the Church limits access, the more it appears to be shielding something significant. And in this tension in between academic curiosity and institutional caution, the mystery of what truly lies hidden only becomes sharper. Over the years, rumors have circulated like faint echoes drifting from behind locked doors. A handful of researchers, speaking cautiously and usually off the record, claim to have encountered references to unidentified gospel fragments during their brief periods of access. Some recount glimpsing handwritten notes by earlier archivists describing non-canonical sayings, while others recall hushed conversations with Vatican scholars who admitted that certain materials were not ready for public study. None of these allegations have been confirmed. The Church dismisses them as misunderstandings, exaggerations, or fabrications. Yet the consistency of these quiet confessions is difficult to overlook. They form a pattern too subtle to prove, yet too persistent to ignore, hinting at a hidden layer of documents waiting beneath the official narrative. Modern technology has transformed the way ancient texts are studied. Carbon dating can pinpoint manuscripts age with startling accuracy. Multispectral imaging can resurrect erased words, and digital reconstruction can piece together fragments once considered unreadable. These tools have already revealed secrets in other archaeological contexts, exposing long-lost writings concealed in damaged scrolls. Inevitably, scholars wonder what might be uncovered if such techniques were applied to every manuscript inside the Vatican archives. Would hidden gospels emerge from beneath centuries of dust and ink? Or would the results challenge long-held beliefs so deeply that institutions hesitate to permit the scrutiny? The potential for revelation is immense, and perhaps to some, unsettling enough to justify keeping certain doors closed. Whenever pressed on the possibility of undisclosed texts, Vatican officials issue responses that are earnest, yet intriguingly precise. They insist that nothing doctrinally harmful is being hidden, a phrase meant to reassure, but one that invites its own questions. What qualifies as harmful, and to whom? Does harmful mean historically disruptive, theologically challenging, or simply difficult to contextualize without stirring confusion? The choice of wording suggests boundaries, lines drawn not around truth, but around interpretation and impact. Even as the Church maintains its posture of integrity, these careful statements create spaces for doubt, shadows where unanswered questions settle. In the end, it is not denial that fuels suspicion, but the deliberate phrasing itself, as if the full story sits just beyond the reach of what can be publicly acknowledged. The surviving fragments of Thomas, Mary, Judas, and other lost gospels reveal a Jesus far more complex than the single portrait preserved in the canon. In one text, he appears as a philosophical teacher guiding seekers toward inner awakening. In another, he becomes a mystical figure, laughing at misunderstanding, urging disciples to see beyond the physical world. Mary's account presents him as a spiritual mentor who entrusts profound teachings to a woman, while Judas's gospel casts him as a strategist, navigating political and cosmic forces. These alternate portraits don't merely add nuance, they reshape the contours of early Christian imagination. Together, they pose a haunting question: which Jesus did the earliest believers truly know, and which version did history choose to remember? If these lost gospels had shaped the foundations of Christian doctrine, the world today might look strikingly different. A tradition guided by Mary's teachings might have embraced gender equality at its core, granting women leadership roles from the very beginning. A faith rooted in Thomas's mystical insights could have cultivated a more introspective spirituality, encouraging believers to seek divine truth within themselves rather than through rigid structures. And if Judas's gospel had been accepted, Christianity might have developed a more complex relationship with political power, viewing betrayal, loyalty, and destiny through a philosophical lens rather than strict moral dualism. Each text represents a path not taken, a version of Christianity that flickered for a moment before vanishing. Imagining these alternate histories highlights how contingent the familiar story truly is. For institutions, the danger of contradictory early texts lies not in their content alone, but in the instability they introduce. A single unified story offers coherence, authority, and continuity. Multiple conflicting narratives invite interpretation, debate, and uncertainty. If believers encountered wildly different portrayals of Jesus, mystic, rebel, philosopher, or cosmic guide, the resulting diversity might fracture the faith's center. This possibility has long stirred institutional fear. What if the truth of early Christianity is too intricate, too divergent, too unsettling to fit neatly into one doctrine? The mere existence of lost gospels whispers that the origins of the faith were far more fluid than tradition suggests, provoking a lingering FOMO tension. What deeper truths remain hidden simply because they resist simplicity? Even with the discoveries of the last century, scholars suspect that countless texts remain hidden in places untouched by modern research. Desert caves still hold secrets, their sealed chambers preserving scrolls that have slept through empires. Remote monasteries guard dusty shelves where cataloging stopped generations ago, leaving forgotten manuscripts waiting in silence. And private collectors, wary of publicity or legal complications, occasionally hint at treasures never shown to the public. Each clue fuels the possibility that the most transformative gospel may still be out there, intact but undiscovered. If a single jar in Nag Hammadi could rewrite centuries of scholarship, what might a new find accomplish? The sense of anticipation remains palpable. The greatest revelation may not lie in what we have uncovered, but in what has yet to emerge from the shadows. Across the long timeline of Christianity, preservation has never been neutral. Some texts were copied, celebrated, and carried into the future, while others faded quietly into obscurity. What survives today reflects centuries of decisions, some intentional, others accidental, made by scribes, bishops, councils, and custodians of the faith. Yet the pattern of selective survival creates its own mystery. For every gospel we can read, others appear only in passing references or fragmented quotes, their full stories swallowed by time, and so we confront an unsettling truth. The gaps in the record may be more revealing than the documents themselves. What we don't see, what we can no longer examine, may hold the forgotten threads that once shaped the earliest Christian imagination. When examining these silences, two interpretations emerge, each compelling in its own way. One suggests deliberate suppression, that church authorities seeking unity and stability withheld teachings they believed could fracture belief or undermine emerging doctrine. The other interpretation is more charitable, proposing that leaders acted not out of secrecy, but out of caution, attempting to shield communities from confusion at a time when literacy was rare and theological nuance easily misunderstood. Perhaps some writings were deemed too obscure, too mystical, or too contradictory to be useful for guiding a growing faith. Yet the tension between these explanations lingers. Were controversial texts hidden because they threatened power, or simply because they complicated an already fragile story? The answer remains elusive, suspended somewhere between practicality and intention. Still, certain clues defy easy categorization. Gaps in archival catalogs, vanished inventory pages, and cryptic references to unnamed fragments continue to puzzle scholars. Testimonials from researchers who glimpsed intriguing but inaccessible listings only deepen the mystery. None of this proves the existence of suppressed gospels, yet none of it comfortably supports the idea of pure coincidence either. These anomalies hover in the historical record like smudges on a window, offering just enough detail to suggest a larger picture concealed beneath. The absence of definitive answers forces us to confront an uncomfortable possibility that the truth about early Christian writings is scattered between what survives, what is rumored, and what may still lie hidden beyond reach. And so we arrive at the final, lingering question: if the lost Gospels were revealed tomorrow, complete, authentic, and unaltered, would they redefine Christianity or simply illuminate truths humanity has long sensed beneath the surface? Would they unveil a forgotten diversity of belief or confirm suspicions that early faith was far more fluid and contested than tradition suggests? Perhaps their greatest impact would not be doctrinal but emotional, reminding us that history is always more complex than the narratives we inherit. In every gap, every vanished manuscript, every whispered rumor, there lies a possibility that refuses to fade. The temptation to know what remains hidden is irresistible, and maybe that is the real mystery, whether the revelations we seek would change the world or merely affirm the curiosity that has driven us here.